narrowed to the swing of my lantern, the knife at my hip, and the map tucked in my pack that no longer mattered. I had come to the high ridges, chasing quiet, charting deer trails and logging roads, trying to outrun a kind of grief that doesn't sit still. But grief has a way of learning your footsteps. It will trail you through the understory, step for step, until you stop, or it does. I didn't stop. The forest stopped for me. Branches shivered, cones rattled free. The air changed temperature the way air does before a lightning strike. I caught a smell, wet iron and musk, rich and ugly enough to coat the back of my tongue. My hand went to the knife without thinking. When the roar came, it started in the earth and rose through my bones. A freight train pulled through a throat. Every inch of me understood the message. Move. I snuffed the lantern, pinched the flame dark with my fingers, and let my eyes adjust to the moon's broken light. There was a clearing ahead. A thin slice of meadow a frost had burned pale. That's where I saw him. A boy, small and rigid as a stake, standing with his back to a deadfall pine. His face was turned, eyes wide enough to catch the moon. Even from a distance, I saw that his hands were empty. No knife, no stick, only fear. "Hey!" I hissed, not daring to be any louder. His head twitched, but his feet didn't. Behind him, the deadfall funneled shadows into a tunnel where something heavier than shadows moved. A second later, the shape separated from the dark. The bear stepped into the clearing like the clearing belonged to it. I had seen grizzlies before, across valleys, through scopes, from the safety of numbers and daylight. Nothing prepared me for how big a bear feels when it's between you and a child. The hump of muscle over its shoulders seemed to flex on its own. Its snout lifted, tasting the night with a long draw, swinging from the boy toward the pines where I crouched. The moon painted its coat in slabs of silver and charcoal. The scars along its muzzle looked like chalk marks left by other bad decisions. It had lived long enough to survive many things. It could survive me. "Move," I mouth-formed to the boy. He didn't blink. Fear had welded him to the earth. I could have run. No one would have blamed me. You don't teach a storm not to. Thunder, you don't teach a grizzly courtesy. But the world narrows around decisions like a noose, and it was tightening around the boy's throat. I slid my pack from my shoulders and set it behind me. Slow, silent. The knife came out smooth, old leather giving up an old habit. My heart was too loud in my ears. I worried the bear would hunt it. The bear turned its head and made a soft sound, softer than its size deserved, a deep chuff that puffed fog into the cold. It rocked onto the balls of its paws, reading the boy's shape, gauging distance the way rain gauges thunder. Predators don't decide, they solve. It lowered its head. I took one step into the clearing, then another, knees loose, weight forward. I threw my voice sideways, away from the boy. "Hey!" I shouted, clean and hard. The sound snapped trees into attention. The bear's head cut toward me like a blade. Its eyes were smaller than I expected, dark stones in a face carved by winter. "Easy," I said, though the word was for the boy and for the part of me that wanted to bolt. I raised the knife so the moon could see it, so the bear could. It didn't care. It cared about angles and hunger and whether this was the right amount of risk for the calories on offer. I grabbed a broken limb from the ground, dry as bone, and struck it against the deadfall. The crack ricocheted. Sparks jumped. The bear flinched, a tiny shiver in a mountain of muscle, then recentered on the boy as if some arithmetic in its head had completed the problem. "Take the smaller one first." "Come to me," I whispered to the child. "Come now." My mouth was steady, my insides were not. He was shaking so hard I could hear his teeth touch. His lips parted. No sound. I saw the faint patterning of beadwork at his collar and the thick braid lying against his shoulder, and I knew enough of these mountains, enough of the families who call them by names older than maps, to understand what this would mean if I failed. The bear stepped. The ground vibrated. I moved without deciding to, cutting across the line between it and the boy, swinging the branch in a wide arc. It cracked again as it met the bear's shoulder and shattered in my hands, splinters like sleet. The grizzly reared, the world going vertical, its height blotting stars, the wet cave of its mouth opening on a sound that made my knees want to fold. I did the only thing left. I ran at it. I heard my father's voice, an old memory, the smell of gun oil and coffee, my small fingers tracing the grooves in a stock I wasn't strong enough to lift. If you can't flee and you can't hide, get loud, get big, get mean. Take the space the fear is trying to take from you. My father had not faced a grizzly with his bare hands. He had, however, taught me not to surrender the part of myself that could try. I screamed not a word, not a plea, just a blade of sound, and jabbed the knife at the air between us, low, high, low, as if cutting doors the beast would think twice before stepping through. I wasn't trying to kill it, I was trying to make it choose. If it wanted me, it could have me, but it would have to forget the boy to do it. I became the brighter, dumber thing. It slammed down. The ground kicked my ankles. Its paw swept faster than a thing that big has a right to move. I jumped, felt the wind of it, felt a sting along my thigh as if the air itself had claws. I stumbled, staggered, caught myself on the deadfall, and shoved off again. The bear's breath hit my face, hot and rank, and in that heat something inside me snapped into its hardest shape. Fear became a tool with an edge. "Run!" I finally got the word out, even if it wasn't meant for me. The boy's feet unglued. He darted along the deadfall's length, small, quick, clever enough to stay near the tangle of limbs where the bear would struggle to pivot. Smart, I thought, even as I lost sight of him. The grizzly followed the bigger threat, me. We circled each other in the chalked ring of moonlight, steam lifting off our bodies like two small storms, deciding whether to collide. My knife looked inadequate even to me. The bear read my stance and read it right. I was not going to put this blade between its ribs with any promise that I'd live long enough to pull it out. I needed something else. Fire, height, noise, leverage, anything. My pack sat 20 paces behind me with the lantern, the flint, the rope, my advantages. The bear sat 2 paces in front of me with everything else. It lunged. I dove to my left, rolled, and came up with a handful of gravel I didn't remember scooping. I threw it into the bear's face. It didn't blind it. It made it blink. A blink was a second. Sometimes a second is a lifetime. I sprinted for the pack. The ground between us felt a mile long. I'd barely crossed half of it when the bear's shoulder hit me like a river in flood. Air crashed out of my lungs. The sky spun twice. I hit a stump hard enough to see white and tasted iron that wasn't the forest. The knife skittered somewhere into weeds. "Here!" I rasped, sucking air like a broken bellows, and clapped my hands, 1, 2, 3, hard and sharp, daring the beast to prefer me to anything else that breathed in these woods. It obliged. It came. I didn't know the boy's name then, didn't know the shape his people's grief would take if the clearing filled with the kind of silence that never lifts. I only knew that the distance between me and the pack was measured in heartbeats and pain, and I had spent too many of both already. I crawled, then pushed, then ran crookedly, grabbing roots, grabbing anything. The pack strap grazed my fingers. I yanked it toward me, tore the flap open, ripped the flint kit free, and seized the lantern. The wick was still damp with oil. My hands shook hard enough to make the metal ring like a bell. The bear's shadow washed over me. I struck the steel. Once, no spark. Twice, weak. The third strike gave me sun in miniature, a burst that kissed the wick. I breathed on it like it was the last candle in a cathedral. The wick caught, guttered, grew, and the lantern's glass bloomed with gold. I spun, thrusting the light into the bear's eyes. It flinched, head tilting, a growl rumbling a question. Pain or surprise? I didn't wait to learn which. I swung the lantern low and wide, throwing a halo around us, pushing the darkness back far enough to reveal the boy a dozen paces to my right, pressed against the deadfall, eyes like storm glass. "Go!" I shouted, voice ripping. "Run to the trees! Stay low!" I pointed with my chin, refusing to take my hands off the only son we had. He moved. The bear did too. I lunged again to take its attention, my boots skating on a carpet of needles. The lantern's flame licked the air, brightening when I needed courage, dimming when I needed more than courage. The bear rocked forward, swatted, and the lantern rang off its claws like a struck bell. Light wavered. I stepped in close, too close, and shoved the burning halo at its face. The smell of singed fur filled the clearing. The grizzly recoiled with a bellow that belonged to older centuries, and its paw hammered the lantern so hard it tore from my grip. The lamp flew, spinning, and smashed against a rock. Fire splashed. A tongue of flame jumped to a knot of dry grass and licked up a fallen branch. The clearing became a strobe of gold and shadow. I had one breath to choose. I chose the boy. I ran, not away, but toward the deadfall where he had disappeared into the tangle. The bear thundered behind me, a drumbeat I felt in my molars. I slid under a crossed pair of trunks, bark tearing my forearm, grabbed the boy's wrist and hauled him into the wedge of space that split the pile of timber like a narrow corridor. He stumbled, then found his feet. I turned, spread my body between him and the opening, raised my empty hands as if they could be walls, and drew in one last breath big enough to carry a scream or a prayer. The bear hit the deadfall, and the deadfall hit back, wood snapping, firelight jittering, smoke turning the air into a taste. My heart beat a message I was not ready to read. And still I did what I had come to understand was the only thing left to do. I stepped out of the wedge to face it. The grizzly lowered its head. The world narrowed to its eyes and the wet rope of its breath, and the knowledge that sometimes the story you end up living is the one you would never have chosen. Behind me the boy was as light as a shadow and as heavy as a promise. "Come on," I whispered to the beast, though I meant it for myself. "Come through me." Then it did. The bear's paw scissored the air, and I learned how many thoughts can fit inside a second when that second might be the last. Impact is a kind of language. The first strike spoke of mass and muscle and the simple physics of a world that doesn't care whether you are brave. It slammed into the deadfall where my head had been, splintering wood with a crack that whistled past my ear. Sap sprayed. I ducked left, heat from the grass fire brushing my cheek, smoke turning my next breath into a cough that sounded like a plea. I didn't have room for pleas, I needed room for choices. The deadfall's tangle made a maze, jagged branches jutting like spears, logs stacked in a downward V that narrowed to a crawl space. The bear's bulk turned that maze into my only advantage. It could reach, it could crush, but it could not easily turn or thread. I could. I slid sideways between two trunk stubs, felt bark groove my jacket and dragged the boy, still shock-stiff, still trusting me because there was no one else. Deeper into the V until the timber pinched the space small enough to make the bear's shoulders hesitate. It didn't hesitate long. A second paw raked. snapping an arm-thick branch as if it were a dry rib. The shockwave drove me to my knees. I shoved the boy behind me and found the knife by instinct where I'd flung it earlier. My fingers closed on the hilt as if the forest had handed it back. I wanted to keep the blade hidden, wanted to save it for the one chance that might matter. But the bear wasn't waiting for plans. It had reduced the night to hunger and obstacles. I needed to reduce it to angles and time. "Listen," I whispered to the boy without looking. "When I say go, you slide left along the ground. Crawl. Keep your belly to the dirt. You'll find a hollow under the roots. Get in. Stay in." He breathed once, ragged, young, and I heard a rustle that could have been a nod. I set my palm on the log beside me and felt it trembling. Realized after a heartbeat that the trembling was mine. The fire to our right had found a vein of pitch and gone bright. Light bled across the clearing, turned needles into threads of gold, painted the bear's face in strokes of copper and shadow. Its eyes reflected the blaze in kinked pinwheels. Smoke flattened under the deadfall and crawled into our wedge, and I understood I would have to choose between breath and bravery soon. The grizzly pushed, shoulder first, testing. The log shifted. I smelled the animal's heat, ancient and clean and terrible. It growled, a lower sound than the one that rends nights. This was conversational, a warning snared in its own chest. I answered with silence and made myself taller in the space I had. Shoulders squared, knife low where the fire wouldn't flash on the steel. Its left paw snaked in, fishing. Claws hooked the air. I waited until the pads grazed the bark, until I could count the ridges in the keratin, and then I jabbed. Not a lunge, not a slash, just a fast, precise stitch aimed at the soft seam where fur thins near the wrist. The knife kissed skin. The bear jerked. Blood beaded, not much. Enough to make a point. It roared again, anger now, and withdrew. The log shook. "Go," I said to the boy, not loud, not soft, just a vector turned into sound. He slid left on his belly exactly as told, a small body learning the shape of survival. I held still until I heard the hiss of him disappearing into the hollow. Then I let out a breath I didn't have and drew in another I couldn't afford, and looked for my next inch of future. The bear surged a second time, hoping I'd be foolish enough to meet mass with bone. I didn't. I let it jam the log deeper into the V, then stepped forward into the space it cleared with its own force, bringing the knife up in a quick vertical cut that thrummed across its nose. A scratch, not a wound, but on a face as alive with nerves as a handsaw with teeth. It seared. The grizzly snapped its head back, paw lashing blind, catching my thigh with a quick rake that felt like fire being drawn in 4 lines under my skin. I bit down on the sound wanting out of my mouth and steadied myself with a hand braced on the log. Pain is a universe that tries to convince you it's the only one. I refused its borders. I stapled my attention to 3 facts. The boy was hidden. The bear's left eye had narrowed. The fire was moving with a wind that had begun to breathe. The orange edge licked toward the creek where it would fail. The smoke would worsen before it improved. If I could last long enough for the bear to decide this cost too much, it might take its hunger elsewhere. If I couldn't, neither of us would be remembered by our right names. "Easy," I said again, more for me than the beast, and swung the knife in small arcs, not threatening, not timid, the language of a thing that will become sharp if pressed. The bear considered me. I saw the thought cross whatever in a bear holds thoughts. Is this meat worth the math? It tested another angle, jaw snaking in, teeth flashing. I shoved the blade toward the tender pink behind the lips without committing to a stab. It took the hint, jaws closing with a clack that vibrated the log. A strand of drool swung and broke, smoking where it hit a coal. The smell lodged in my throat. My eyes watered. I blinked stinging tears into clarity. Out past the deadfall, my fallen lantern guttered around its broken glass, flame small but stubborn, a lesson I appreciated enough to steal. I spotted a length of branch whose end had caught, a makeshift torch glowing dull red, one lick of flame nibbling it to life. If I could get that fire in my hand without giving the bear my arm, I could end the conversation we were having and start a new one the bear might answer with retreat. The distance between me and the torch was 5 paces through air the bear owned. I made a choice the way you jump into cold water, all at once before sense can talk you out of it. I fainted right, scraping my knife hard along the log so the metal screamed. The sound drove a spike even through my skull. The bear flinched left, eyes squeezing against the shriek. I dove past its right shoulder, rolling into the clearing, my back skidding on needles that dug like glass. The bear pivoted with alarming speed, but the deadfall snagged its hips, cost it the half-second my life had borrowed. I seized the burning branch and came up on one knee, swinging the ember end in a flat arc that trailed sparks. The torch coughed flame just as I needed it. Fire found breath and heat licked my knuckles. I drove the blaze at the bear's face. It swung and I met claw with fire, wood cracking in my hands. The grizzly's paw swept through flame and a flurry of sparks exploded like a swarm of furious bees. The fur on its outer wrist flared dull and then smoldered. The smell scorched the air. The bear snarled. Not fear, not yet, but attention sharpened into something that wanted distance. We danced. I kept the torch between us, short jabs, never letting it see the same rhythm twice. I cut left when it expected right, advanced when it expected retreat, stepping to the drum beat of my own pulse, which had become the only music left. Smoke smeared the night. Fire threaded itself through the bear's vision and mine. The creek's whisper grew louder as if it were talking itself into courage. I didn't try to win. I tried to make quitting look smart. Another swat. I met it with flame again, and this time the bear's paw connected with the torch so hard the branch snapped in the middle, the lit end flipping behind me into the grass. The darkness rushed back, drawn to fill the space the fire had bullied it out of. The grizzly shouldered forward to seize that advantage. I gave it something else to seize. I threw the stump of the unlit end at its face, not as a weapon but as a punctuation, and as it flinched I stepped inside its reach and slashed a quick bright line down the side of its muzzle. Blood welled. It reeled, more surprised than injured. The noise that came out of it this time had a hinge of uncertainty. It backed 1 step, 2. Its gaze flicked from me to the wobbling light behind me, to the fire's edge crawling toward the creek and the smoke bank that had thickened into a gray wall banded with gold. Predator solve. It did the math again. I didn't chase it. I didn't blink. I let it see every reason not to finish what it had started. The fire brightening behind me, my refusal to become small, the pain I was willing to deliver and take. It huffed once, a sound like a slammed door, and turned in a muscular, irritated pivot that crushed a patch of young ferns flat. It moved out of the deadfall with 3 deliberate steps, then 4. Pausing once to display its shoulder as if to say we had both learned something the hard way. The 5th step took it into the tree line. The 6th took it out of sight. The 7th I didn't see because my vision finally pulsed black and returned in grainy frames. I kept the knife up until the forest sounds began to trickle back. A cricket brave enough to try 1 thread of song, the creek letting itself be water again. A single pine cone rolling down to a rest. I counted to 30, then 30 again. Then I let my arm fall and the knife tip touched earth and the earth felt very far away. "Are you hurt?" The boy's voice came, small and hoarse from the hollow. It was the first time I had heard it. The sound reached me like a rope thrown across a chasm. "I'm here," I said, and for a moment that was all I had. I reached into the V, groped until my fingers found his wrist again, warm and thin, pulse rapid under skin. I guided him out slowly, careful of the splinters and the hidden nails of the forest, and when he stood in front of me shaking, I saw his face properly. The dust, the tear tracks cut clean through it, the stubborn set to his mouth that explained how he had lived long enough for me to find him. He was Cherokee. I knew from the beadwork, from the patterns sewn into his collar, from the braid tied with the strip of dyed leather. His eyes were dark and brilliant in the firelight, full of 100 questions and the single answer that mattered. We were alive. "What's your name?" I asked. He swallowed. "Oren," he said, barely more than an exhale. "Oren," I repeated to anchor him to the night as something other than a victim. "I'm Seraphine. We're moving now." He glanced at the fire, at the dark that had taken the bear back, and then at my leg where blood had already darkened my jeans in 4 unmistakable lines. "You're bleeding," he said, the words like a new guilt. "It's a scratch," I lied, because it wasn't the kind of truth we could afford. "Can you walk?" He nodded, even if the nod was an act of bravery before it was a fact. I fished a strip of cloth from my pack and cinched it tight around my thigh. Teeth gritted against the throb. The knot came out ugly but strong. I splashed dirt onto the nearest tongues of flame to slow them and kicked the snapped lantern farther from the burn, then pointed us toward the shadowed side of the clearing where the trees grew close and the smoke thinned. "Stay behind me," I said, hand on my pack strap. "If I stop, you drop. If I run, you duck left and follow." I didn't explain the rules twice. He understood. His small fingers hooked the strap like a sailor catching a line. We moved into the trees, the clearing shrinking behind us to a circle of flickering gold we would not return to. Every step pulled a wire through my leg. Every breath tugged smoke out of my throat. Every sense strained for the rhythm of heavy paws in leaf litter that did not come. I knew better than to trust silence, but I trusted that we had earned a margin. After 50 paces, the creek found us, a ribbon of cold, insistent sound. I knelt on the bank and washed my knife clean, then my hands, then my face, and finally the long scratches on my thigh. The cold was a different kind of fire, medicinal and unforgiving. I hissed through my teeth and then laughed, a brittle thing that startled even me because it was relief wearing humor's face. "Thank you," Oren said, as if the words were a ritual he had been taught to deliver to the mountain itself. They landed inside me like heat finds iron. "You don't have to thank me yet," I said, pushing to my feet. "We still have to get you home." "Home," he echoed, a sound that held both a location and a people inside it. He looked at me with something like wonder and something like wariness, and for the first time I felt the weight of what I was walking toward. Not just a fire-lit camp and a circle of strangers, but the kinds of questions that have teeth. We moved downstream, keeping to the dark bank where the smoke didn't chase us. Somewhere behind the trees, the bear rearranged its night around new calculations and left us to ours. The forest loosened by inches, the way a fist does when it decides not to strike again. We followed the slow slur of water, 2 shadows stitched together by necessity and something that would later be called by larger names. I didn't think of loyalty then. I didn't think of legend. I thought of distance and stitches and whether dawn would arrive more gently than the night had left us. I thought of the boy's hand on my pack strap and how small it felt and how strong. I thought of the way the bear's eyes had held fire and reflected it back at me like a promise I hadn't meant to make. I thought of how some stories begin with a roar and some begin with a decision, and sometimes they are the same thing. Behind us, the clearing's last flames thinned into a red smudge the wind smeared across the trees, and ahead of us the water curved east, where the first hint of a paler sky would find us. We walked into it, Oren and I, leaving blood and smoke and a problem I hoped would not decide to solve itself twice. When the path narrowed, I let him pass me so I could watch our back trail. And he went without protest, shoulders squared in a way I had not seen when the night began. "You did well," I told him. It wasn't comfort, it was a fact. He said nothing, but the line of his neck softened, and his steps took on a cadence that sounded like a heartbeat learning it would keep going. Mine matched it. I saved him, but at what cost? It wasn't a question I was ready to answer. Not yet. The forest holds on to debts the way it holds on to secrets. Some you pay with blood. Some you pay with the story you will have to tell when you walk into the firelight of a people who will wonder why you brought their son home breathing and yourself in pieces. We kept walking. He clung to me as if I was his last chance at life, and maybe I was. The forest had grown quieter than I thought possible, a silence so profound that it felt like an unwelcome truth pressing against my skin. The bear's roar still lived inside my body, not in echoes but in tremors, as if the sound had fused with my bones. My arms ached from carrying Oren, his small frame both fragile and impossibly heavy, like the weight of every choice I had made that brought me here. His body trembled against mine, not just from cold but from something deeper, something older than fear. I knew that feeling. I had carried it too, the hollow rhythm of abandonment, the knowledge of being left unprotected in a world that did not care whether you survived. Each step I took through the undergrowth felt like crossing into a memory I didn't want to face. The damp earth clung to my boots, roots reaching for my ankles like skeletal hands, the forest itself asking why I had interfered in a story that wasn't mine. I thought about the boy's silence, how he hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, hadn't even whispered my name because he didn't trust me yet. And why should he? Trust was not something you gave to strangers who appeared in the middle of terror. Trust was something fragile, bruised, a thing earned over long nights and quiet gestures like a slow fire coaxed from stubborn flint. I felt his fingers tighten on my jacket, small claws anchoring himself to me as if he was afraid that if he let go, he would vanish, another forgotten child swallowed by shadows. His silence was not emptiness, it was grief. It was the silence of foster homes with cracked walls and the indifference of adults who glance at you but never really see you. It was the silence I knew too well, the kind that had once pressed against me in dim diners where I sat alone with coffee gone cold, or in sterile clinics where second chances were promised but rarely delivered. His silence was a mirror. And in carrying him, I was also carrying every broken version of myself I had tried to bury. The forest's narrow paths became metaphors for streets I had once walked under indifferent city lights. Those cracked sidewalks where I hid behind headphones so I didn't have to hear my own thoughts. Those glass reflections in shop windows that reminded me how faceless I had become to everyone around me. I had left that world to chase solitude, to vanish into wilderness where no one could ask questions about my bruised past. Yet here I was, clutching someone else's future to my chest, feeling the raw tremor of his heartbeat against my ribs. I wanted to tell him that he was safe, that I wouldn't let him be abandoned again, but the words stuck in my throat. Promises had always felt like lies when I spoke them aloud because my own childhood had been riddled with broken vows. Letters never answered, hands withdrawn. The silence of those who should have stayed but didn't. So instead, I just adjusted his weight in my arms and kept moving. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. The night deepened. Smoke from the burned clearing lingered in my lungs, clinging to the edges of my breath, making each exhale taste of ash. My thigh burned where the bear's claws had left their message, a reminder that survival comes with scars, both seen and hidden. I stumbled once, knees scraping against rock, and Oren made a soft sound, not a word, not a plea, but a quiet gasp that pierced me deeper than any wound. It was the sound of vulnerability, the sound of someone realizing that survival depends entirely on another person's strength. "Don't be afraid," I whispered, though I was speaking more to myself than to him. Vulnerability had never been my strength. I had lived most of my life inside walls made of silence and distance, faceless to those who might have cared if I had let them close. But now, with his fingers digging into me, I felt the crumbling of those walls, one fragile brick at a time. The forest shifted, opening into a faint trail, moonlight falling like fractured glass on the ground. In the distance, I saw smoke rising, thin, steady, deliberate. A camp, a community. Oren stirred against me as if sensing the familiarity of the sight. His head lifted slightly from my shoulder, and though his voice never came, the recognition was clear. He knew this place. It was his home, but fear laced through me like barbed wire. What would they see when I stepped into their firelight? Would they see the truth, that I had saved him? Or would they see only a stranger carrying their wounded boy, bloodied and scarred, and assume betrayal? The image of their eyes burned into my thoughts before I ever saw them. I imagined suspicion, mistrust, the way humans always judge first and ask later. My own past whispered in my ears, "You don't belong anywhere. People will always push you out before you can settle in." The boy's weight reminded me that I had a choice: to walk into that suspicion and risk their anger, or to leave him at the edge of his world and vanish back into mine. For a heartbeat, the thought of disappearing tugged at me. To vanish was easier than to face recognition, judgment, and the possibility of rejection. But then Oren shifted. His cheek brushing against my collarbone, his breath shallow but steady, and I realized the truth. I had already chosen. I had chosen the moment I ran at the bear instead of running from it. I had chosen when I bled so he could breathe, and choices like that have no undoing. So I walked toward the smoke, carrying him not as a burden but as a vow. A vow that even if the tribe cast me out, even if they cursed my name, he would remember the woman who refused to let him die alone. In his silence, I found the kind of bond that doesn't require words, an unspoken connection forged in blood, fire, and fear. And as the campfires flickered closer, I whispered a promise only he could hear. "I will not abandon you." When I entered their camp, every eye turned to me, and not a single one saw me as a savior. The first thing I felt was heat, the warmth of firelight on my face after the bitter chill of the forest night. The second thing I felt was the cold weight of judgment, eyes pinning me in place before I could even speak. I had crossed from wilderness into community, but it felt less like safety and more like stepping into a trial. The Cherokee camp was alive with flickers of flame and shadows that moved like restless spirits. Warriors stood, their silhouettes sharp against the fire, spears in hand, bows strung tight with arrows that glinted in the light. Women froze in their tasks, clay bowls suspended mid-air, children clutching at skirts as they stared with wide, frightened eyes. Every face turned to me, and in each one I saw suspicion, fear, and something sharper, accusation. Oren stirred in my arms, his small body twitching with the half-conscious recognition of home. For a fleeting second I thought his presence would shield me, that carrying him would explain everything. But I was wrong. To them I wasn't a savior. I was a stranger, bloodied and scarred, clutching their boy as if I had stolen him from their world. The air filled with voices, harsh and low, like the growl of another beast. "Who is she?" someone demanded. "Why does she have our boy?" another cried. The words wrapped around me like chains, tightening, suffocating. Then a man stepped forward, taller than the others, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice. His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked on me with the weight of centuries. This was Garrick Rowan, the tribal chief. His authority was quiet, but it pressed down harder than the weapons pointed in my direction. He studied me as if I were a riddle carved into stone, his gaze lingering on the blood at my thigh, the dirt smeared across my jacket, and the fragile, sleeping form of Oren clutched to my chest. "Why is he with you?" Garrick's voice was steady, but beneath it lay steel. I opened my mouth, but no words came. My throat felt sealed shut the way it had been in courtrooms and social worker offices when people had judged me without hearing my side. My silence condemned me as much as their suspicion did. The weight of their mistrust was crushing, a mirror of every moment I had ever felt unwanted, unseen, unrecognized for the truth inside me. I wanted to scream that I had saved him, that I had bled for him, that my scars were proof of loyalty, not betrayal. But my voice betrayed me. It trembled when I tried to form words, cracking under the pressure of too many buried years of rejection. Vulnerability clung to me like a second skin, and in their eyes, vulnerability looked like guilt. They began to close in, a half-circle of shadows pressing tighter. Someone spat on the ground at my feet. Another muttered a word that I didn't understand, but I knew its meaning. It was a curse, a condemnation. Oren shifted again, his eyes fluttering, but he did not wake. His silence made me look guiltier, as though I had silenced him myself. The firelight painted Garrick's face in shades of bronze and shadow, his jaw tense with suspicion. He raised a hand and the murmurs fell to a low hum, but the tension thickened, unbroken. "You carry him," he said, "but that does not mean you saved him. For all we know, you are the reason he was in danger." The words pierced deeper than the bear's claws. They weren't just an accusation, they were a dismissal of everything I had endured. And yet I understood their fear. To them I was an intruder, an outsider who had entered their sacred circle uninvited. The forest may have accepted me for one night, but people were harder than wilderness, and their wounds from outsiders were older than I could imagine. My body trembled not from the wound, but from the familiar ache of being misunderstood. Loneliness pressed harder now, heavier than any night spent in empty apartments or diners where I had been invisible among strangers. This was worse because I wasn't invisible. I was seen, but seen wrongly, my truth buried under their suspicion. I looked at Oren, his face soft in the glow, and thought of what it meant to be judged before you could speak. His silence was my silence. His vulnerability was my own reflected back. And though I could not find my voice, I made myself stand taller, lifting him slightly higher, as if to say with my body what my words could not. I carried him because he mattered. I carried him because no one else had been there too. But Garrick's eyes did not soften. The tribe's murmurs grew louder again, waves crashing against me. And as the night pressed in, I realized that saving Oren from the bear was only the beginning. The real battle was here in the firelight, where truth and lies tangled in silence, and where the boy's voice, the only voice that could save me, remained locked in the prison of unconsciousness. And so I stood, trapped between the wilderness that had scarred me and the tribe that was ready to condemn me, wondering if survival had only delivered me into a different kind of death, the kind that comes not from claws or teeth but from judgment and mistrust. Before I could explain, they had already decided my fate. The circle tightened around me as if the fire itself had built walls from flame and suspicion. Oren lay limp against my shoulder, his body fever-warm, his breath shallow. But still the tribe's eyes burned hotter than any ember. Their silence was not empty. It was a verdict forming in real time, a sentence sharpened by fear and history. I had seen these kinds of eyes before, eyes that did not see me for who I was but for what they feared I represented. Foster homes, crowded diners, courtrooms filled with murmurs. All those spaces had prepared me for this moment, and yet it still stripped me raw. Chief Garrick Rowan stood unmoving, his broad frame outlined by the fire. His silence was deliberate, a silence heavy, with power, the kind that forces others to speak for you. And they did. Voices rose, sharp, angry, fractured with grief. "She has blood on her," one man shouted, pointing at the gash on my thigh as though wounds were proof of guilt. "She brought him here half dead," another cried, his words jagged with accusation. "Why would a stranger risk her life for one of ours?" someone else asked. But it was not really a question. It was a declaration. No stranger could be trusted. Every word they hurled was a stone, and though none struck my skin, each one lodged inside me. My silence felt heavier than the boy in my arms, heavier than the scars still bleeding beneath my clothes. I wanted to scream the truth, to tell them about the bear, about how the forest itself had demanded a sacrifice and how I had given my blood so Oren could keep his breath. But my throat closed around the words. Years of abandonment and dismissal had taught me that explanations don't matter when people have already chosen what to believe. Oren's head lolled against my shoulder, his braid brushing my cheek, and I tightened my arms around him, not as defense but as proof. I thought maybe my posture could speak louder than my tongue, that the way I carried him would tell them I had carried more than just his weight. But their eyes read me differently, painting me as a thief who had stolen what was not hers to hold. Chief Garrick finally lifted his hand and the voices stilled. His gaze pierced me, not unkind but relentless, like a surgeon deciding whether the wound before him could be healed or should be cut away. His voice came steady, deep as roots. "You stand before us with our child in your arms. You bleed, but blood is not always sacrifice. Blood can also be guilt. Speak. Why should we not cast you out?" The demand cracked something inside me. My voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, fractured, uncertain. "He was alone," I said, the words trembling like a candle in a draught. "The bear would have torn him apart. My throat betrayed me. Every syllable sounded like weakness, like lies. Their eyes hardened. I tried again, louder. "I saved him. I bled for him." My hand gestured to the bandage at my thigh, to the scratches burning across my skin, but it was useless. Wounds are evidence only when someone wants to believe you. To them, my scars were weapons turned inward, proof that violence followed me wherever I went. Garrick's jaw tightened. He looked at Oren, then back at me. His silence was worse than accusation. It was doubt, sharpened into a blade. Finally, he turned to the crowd and said, "Until the boy speaks, we cannot trust her." The murmurs swelled, agreement rising like a tide. Their judgment was complete. My words had fallen like broken arrows, and their silence filled the spaces where truth should have lived. I stood there trembling, Orin in my arms, knowing that sometimes survival is not about fighting beasts with claws and teeth. Sometimes survival is about enduring the cruelty of being unseen, unheard, unrecognized. And in that moment I wondered if saving him had only delivered me into a new kind of wilderness, the wilderness of mistrust, where human hearts can be colder than any night in the forest. Just when they were ready to condemn me, his weak voice cut through the air. The judgment was closing in. Garrick Rowan's hand hovered in the air as if preparing to give a signal that would end my story before it had even begun. Warriors stood tense, ready to seize me, to tear Orin from my arms, to cast me out into the night like a trespasser unworthy of firelight. My heart raced with the knowledge that I had bled in vain, that all the resilience I had carried through my scars meant nothing here. And then, in the crack of silence, Orin stirred. It was small at first, just a faint twitch of his fingers on my sleeve, a flutter of lashes against pale cheeks. His lips parted, releasing a breath that carried more weight than any council's decree. A murmur rippled through the tribe as his eyes opened, heavy, clouded, but alive. I bent closer, whispering, "You're safe now," though safety still felt like a lie. His gaze drifted slow until it found Garrick Rowan's face, and then with a trembling effort it returned to mine. That moment, those seconds of recognition, was not just survival. It was redemption. It was the moment vulnerability found its voice. "Bear," Orin whispered, his voice cracked but sharp enough to pierce the silence. She fought the bear. The camp shifted. Every body leaned forward as if pulled by the same invisible thread. His voice wavered, but his words carried the weight of truth that mine could never hold. The bear would have killed me. She stood in front. She bled. Because of me, I felt his hand grip mine, fragile yet certain. His eyes filled with something more than fear, something closer to recognition, a fragile kind of trust that had been denied to me all night. In that trust was the seed of something unspoken, a bond that had no name yet, but one that would root itself deep. The tribe erupted with voices no longer in anger but in disbelief. Some gasped, some fell into silence, others muttered in awe. Garrick's face remained unreadable, but his eyes sharpened with the weight of Orin's testimony. "He calls her Bear Sister," an elder woman said softly, her voice trembling with awe. "He names her in our way." That name spread in whispers. Bear Sister. It was not just a title. It was recognition. It was the boy's way of giving me a place in his story. In that single fragile moment, he offered me what I had sought my entire life: belonging. My throat burned with tears I would not let fall. To be trusted even by a child felt like healing stitched over old scars. Orin's voice had given me what my own could not: forgiveness, resilience, the promise of a second chance. The firelight flickered across Garrick Rowan's face, softening the harsh lines for just an instant. His silence was no longer condemnation. It was consideration. And though he said nothing yet, I knew the tide had shifted. I looked down at Orin, his small hand still clinging to mine, his chest rising with shallow but steady breaths. His vulnerability had saved me, his truth had given me redemption. In his voice, I had found not just survival, but the first fragile spark of an unspoken connection that neither of us fully understood yet. And in that moment, beneath the eyes of a tribe ready to judge me, I realized something deeper. Sometimes it is not strength or resilience that saves us. Sometimes it is the courage of the most fragile voice breaking silence that changes everything. They said if I wanted their trust, I had to earn it, and earn it with my blood and sweat. When Oren's voice broke through the firelit silence, something in the tribe shifted, but mistrust does not vanish in a single breath. Garrick Rowan's face softened only slightly, his eyes narrowing as though he had glimpsed a possibility but not yet a certainty. Trust was not given here. It was weighed, measured, and only handed to those who proved themselves beyond doubt. And so it was decided. For 3 days I would be tested. The announcement spread through the camp like wind stirring dry leaves. 3 days of trials, 3 nights under the gaze of strangers who did not know my scars, who had never walked the cracked sidewalks of cities where I learned to disappear. To them I was not Seraphine Hale, a woman stitched together by abandonment and survival. To them I was only a question, threat or ally, intruder or sister. The first day began with firewood and distance. They sent me into the forest with nothing but my knife, ordering me to gather enough timber to fuel their fires for the night. It sounded simple, but the task was not about wood. It was about endurance. My thigh ached with every step, the wound from the bear tugging open each time I bent to lift a log. Sweat stung my eyes, and every swing of the blade reminded me of survival's cruel lesson. Pain is the currency we pay for belonging. As I dragged the bundles back to camp, I saw children watching from the shadows, whispering behind their hands. Their eyes reminded me of the faces I had seen in foster care. Quiet, cautious, carrying too much understanding for their age. They looked at me the way I once looked at strangers who entered my life briefly, always wondering if they would stay or vanish like the others. Their gaze pressed against me with an unspoken plea, "Prove you are different." The second day tested my resilience. They asked me to stand before the river that cut through their land and cross its furious current without ropes or bridges. The water was ice-fed, its surface fractured by white caps and jagged rocks. My chest seized at the sight. I remembered city nights when I had stood before glass towers, looking up at penthouses glowing warm with lives I would never touch. The same sharp distance yawning between me and them as between me and this river. I stepped into the water and cold wrapped me like chains. The current seized my legs, dragging me sideways, reminding me how easily the world can strip you down to nothing. But I had lived my life against currents stronger than water. I thought of diners at midnight where I had eaten alone, of luxury cars that hissed by cracked sidewalks without seeing me, of the mirror reflections in shop windows that showed me a woman faceless, untethered, unseen. I had crossed worse rivers, the invisible ones of loneliness, abandonment, silence. I pushed forward step by step, lungs burning, muscles tearing. When I emerged on the far bank, soaked and shaking, Garrick Rowan stood watching with arms folded. His eyes gave nothing away, but I thought I saw the faintest nod, a recognition so subtle I almost mistook it for a trick of the light. The third day was not about strength or endurance. It was about respect. They brought me into the circle of their elders, where silence reigned heavier than any storm. Cassian Wolf, the shaman, studied me with eyes like polished obsidian, deep and reflective, as though he saw not just me but the shadows I carried. Before me lay objects, stones, feathers, a carved figure of a bear. They told me to choose one, not with haste but with honesty. My hand hovered over the stones, smooth and weighty, symbols of resilience. The feathers whispered of freedom, of flight I had never known. But it was the carved bear that drew me, the scars etched into its wooden snout, the stance of defiance. I reached for it, and when my fingers curled around its weight, I felt a mirror reflection of myself. The tribe saw it too, because a ripple passed through the circle. "You choose the scarred one. Cassian said, his voice low but certain. Not the stone, not the feather. You recognize yourself in wounds. I lowered my eyes, not in shame, but in quiet recognition. Scars remind us that survival has a price, I said softly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded, and that we pay it not once, but every day we wake up and carry them forward. The silence that followed was heavy, but different from before. It was not the silence of mistrust, but the silence of recognition, of an unspoken bond forming in the space between my brokenness and theirs. When the third night fell, I sat by the fire alone, Orrin asleep nearby. His hand twitched in dreams as though he still clung to me even in sleep. I looked at him and realized the truth of these trials. They were not just about proving myself to the tribe. They were about proving to myself that I could still fight for belonging, that redemption was not just a word reserved for others. I had survived the wilderness, the bear, and the tribe's suspicion. But the hardest part was surviving my own doubt, my own scars that whispered I would always be an outsider. And yet as the firelight flickered on Orrin's face, I felt something unfamiliar stir inside me. Not triumph, not even relief, but a fragile sense of hope. A second chance, delicate as a flame, waiting to be nurtured. On the third night, the shaman revealed a dream, and it had my face in it. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing like scattered stars across blackened wood. The tribe gathered close, the air filled with the smell of smoke and the rustle of anticipation. Cassian Wolf, the shaman, rose from his place, his figure tall and lean, his hair braided with feathers that caught the dying firelight. His eyes, dark and endless, swept over the circle before settling on me. I dreamed, he said, his voice steady as riverstone. And in my dream the bear roared not as a beast, but as a herald. His words carried the weight of prophecy, the kind that roots itself into the marrow of those who hear it. The tribe leaned forward. Whispers rippled through them, but I sat still, every muscle tense, every scar inside me bracing for judgment. Cassian's gaze held me as though I were the mirror in which his dream had been reflected. The bear came not to destroy, but to test. It stood in the way of a stranger, a woman scarred, a woman carrying her own emptiness, and it demanded blood. She gave it, not for herself, but for the child. And in giving it, she crossed from loneliness into belonging. The words pierced me more deeply than any spear. Loneliness, emptiness, belonging. He had named the ghosts I carried, the faceless ache of nights spent staring out windows of apartments where silence pressed against glass. The echoes of footsteps on cracked sidewalks where no one walked beside me. He had spoken aloud the truth I had buried in the unlit corners of myself. His voice softened, yet every syllable struck like a drum. The dream showed me that she was not sent by chance. She was sent by need. Her scars are not curses, but proof that she knows the weight of pain. And only those who know pain can shoulder another's. I looked down at my hands, trembling in the firelight. They were hands marked by hidden pain, hands that had held loneliness, that had once pressed against mirrors searching for recognition, that had clutched letters never sent, truths never spoken. I thought of missed connections, of love I had once mistaken for salvation, but which had left me emptier than before. And now here I was, seated in a circle of strangers, being told that my brokenness was not weakness, but destiny. The tribe absorbed his words in silence. Some nodded slowly, others frowned, still uncertain. But Garrick Rowan's face remained unreadable, his jaw clenched as if wrestling between caution and surrender. Cassian stepped closer, his shadow falling across me. His voice lowered, meant only for me, though everyone heard it. "You carry hidden pain," he said. but hidden pain can be a map. You are here not to escape your scars, but to use them. The boy calls you Bear Sister because he recognizes the truth of what you are becoming. The name settled over me like a cloak, heavy yet strangely fitting. Bear Sister. It was not a fairy tale name, not a word dressed in fantasy. It was raw, real, rooted in survival and scars. It did not erase my loneliness, but it gave it meaning. It did not promise love in storybook terms, but it promised connection in the language of resilience. I felt Oren stir beside me, his small hand finding mine in his sleep, his grip instinctive, unspoken. That touch was the quiet transformation I had been waiting for, the kind of emotional intimacy that does not arrive with fireworks but with presence, with silence shared between two broken souls who find in each other a second chance. Cassian's words echoed in me long after the fire dimmed. You are not here by accident. You are here because your scars led you here. For the first time in years, I lifted my gaze to meet the eyes around me, and I did not flinch. Because in that circle of firelight, for the first time, I felt something shift deep within me. Not belonging. Not yet. But the possibility of it. The kind of possibility that asks you to open up after years of closing off. And in that fragile opening, I realized the truth. Survival had brought me here. But maybe healing would keep me. As his wounds closed, I realized mine were just beginning to heal. Oren's recovery began quietly, almost invisibly, like the slow unfurling of dawn after a night that seemed endless. At first, his body was a fragile map of bruises and shallow breaths, his eyes clouded with the lingering shadows of the bear's roar. I stayed close, watching each rise and fall of his chest, each twitch of his fingers, knowing that healing is not a spectacle. It is a long silence broken by fragile victories. The tribe tended to him in ways that spoke of ancient rituals, applying salves ground from roots, whispering prayers over his wounds, bathing his skin in water drawn from the river. I sat at his side, not as a healer but as a witness, my hands restless, my heart divided between gratitude and guilt. Gratitude that he lived. Guilt that survival had scarred him, that his childhood innocence had been split open too soon. Sometimes late at night when the fire dimmed and the camp settled into sleep, Oren would stir and his eyes would find me. He wouldn't speak. He didn't have to. The unspoken connection hung between us like a thread invisible to others, spun from fear and blood and the desperate choice I had made in the clearing. His gaze held questions he didn't know how to ask. Why had I risked everything for him? Did I see something in him that others had overlooked? And I did. In him I saw myself. The child who had once waited in foster care hallways for a face that never appeared. Who had once traced her own reflection in diner windows wishing someone would notice. I saw the loneliness that comes when trust is stolen too early, when the world teaches you that you are easy to abandon. The more I watched him heal, the more I recognized how much of my own healing had been left undone. His silence mirrored mine. His scars reflected the ones I had hidden under layers of distance, under the armor of pretending I didn't need anyone. Sitting beside him felt like holding a mirror up to my own bruised past. And for the first time, I didn't turn away. There were nights when he would reach for my hand without a word, his small fingers curling into mine as though testing whether I would pull away. I never did. I held him, steady, letting him feel the promise that had once been denied to me. That sometimes someone stays. That sometimes scars are not the end of trust, but the beginning of it. The tribe watched us with caution, but also with curiosity. They saw the way Oren's eyes softened when he looked at me, the way his hand sought mine instinctively. Some of them frowned, uneasy with the bond forming between us, but others whispered among themselves, saying it was a bond earned in fire and fear, one that could not be undone. In the stillness of those nights, I reflected on my own survival. I remembered the cracked sidewalks of cities where I had walked faceless among crowds, the streetlights casting their yellow glow on my empty shadows. I remembered the sterile loneliness of penthouses where I had worked briefly, cleaning rooms filled with wealth but stripped of warmth. I remembered the silence of clinics where second chances were promised but rarely kept, and the way I had once pressed my forehead against a bathroom mirror, whispering to my reflection that I didn't know if I could keep going. Now, sitting in the firelight beside Oren, I realized I was keeping going, not just for myself, but for him. His healing was my redemption, his fragile trust, the second chance I hadn't believed in. One evening, as the fire painted gold across our faces, Oren spoke softly, his voice raw but certain. "You are Bear Sister." The name, once whispered by others, became truth when it left his lips. It wasn't a fairy tale name, it wasn't fragile, it was heavy, real, rooted in scars and survival. It was the first time I felt recognized, not as an outsider, not as a stranger, but as someone whose pain had meaning. And in that moment I realized healing doesn't always come from within. Sometimes it comes from being seen, being named, being trusted when you least expect it. His wounds were closing, yes, but in watching him heal, I was finding the pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. That night, I didn't know if they were gathering to honor me or to cast me away forever. The third day ended with fire and anticipation. The tribe gathered in their largest circle, flames rising high enough to send sparks into the sky, as if trying to pierce the stars themselves. The air was thick with smoke and tension, with the weight of judgment that had been postponed but not erased. I sat near the edge, Oren by my side, his hand in mine. He was stronger now, his skin no longer fever-hot, his voice a quiet presence that tethered me to hope. But the camp was divided. Some looked at me with softened eyes, others with suspicion still sharp as flint. Tonight they would decide. The feast spread before us was more than food. It was a ritual, a test, a gathering of voices meant to reach consensus. Women laid out venison, corn, berries. Men brought fresh fish from the river. The fire crackled, smoke curling upward like prayers. Yet beneath the abundance was tension, as if each bite carried unspoken questions. Did I belong? Could they trust me? Was I to be one of them or forever an intruder? Garrick Rowan rose, his shadow tall against the flames. His voice cut through the murmurs like a blade through cloth. We gather not only to eat, but to decide. She has faced our trials, she has endured, she has carried scars and silence alike, but the question remains. Do we call her sister or do we cast her out? The words rippled across the circle, heavy as stones dropped in water. Whispers rose. Some argued that Oren's voice was proof enough that no child could fabricate such trust. Others insisted that scars do not erase suspicion, that one woman's survival does not guarantee loyalty. I sat silent, my hand tightening on Oren's, my throat raw with the memory of every place I had been unwanted. The setting reminded me of those urban nights when I had walked past diners glowing warm from within but too afraid to step inside. Of the penthouse emptiness I had once dusted in silence, watching families from a distance I could never cross. Now I was again on the edge of belonging, waiting for a verdict I could not control. Cassian Wolf rose, his feathers catching the light. I dreamed, he said, and in my dream the bear's roar was not only warning, it was invitation. She carries wounds that mirror ours. She bleeds as we have bled. And only one who knows pain can walk beside us in truth. His words drew nods from some, silence from others. Garrick remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on me as though weighing my soul. Then, unexpectedly, Oren rose to his feet. His voice was small, trembling, but it cut deeper than any elder's decree. "She saved me," he said, his eyes sweeping the circle. "She bled for me. If you cast her out, you cast me too." Gasps broke through the crowd. The boy's loyalty was unshakable, his words not rehearsed but born from the raw truth of survival. He turned, looking at me with a kind of fragile courage that stole my breath. His voice trembled, but it did not falter. "She is Bear sister. She belongs." The silence that followed was unlike the silence of judgment. It was the silence of recognition, of hearts bending under the weight of truth. Garrick Rowan's jaw clenched, then slowly released. He looked at Oren, then at me, and finally he nodded. The decision was made. The tribe exhaled as one, the fire crackling louder as though celebrating its own verdict. Food was passed, songs rose, laughter slowly replaced tension. The feast had become not exile, but acceptance. I sat there, stunned, the taste of venison on my tongue, the sound of voices weaving into one rhythm. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of belonging settle into my chest like a fragile flame. Oren leaned against me, his hand steady in mine, and I realized that sometimes family is not blood but bond, not history but choice. That night the feast was not just about food or fire. It was about forgiveness, resilience, and the quiet miracle of being recognized when you least expect it. And as the stars glowed above us, I thought, maybe this was not the end of my exile. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of home. Instead of sending me away, they knelt before me. The fire was nearly burned to embers when Garrick Rowan stood, his shadow cast long across the circle. For 3 days I had lived suspended in uncertainty, caught between exile and belonging, but now the moment had come. His silence stretched, pressing on my chest like a weight I could not lift. Around him the tribe leaned forward, waiting to hear their verdict spoken aloud. My heart raced with memories of all the times I had been unwanted. Those foster care corridors where caseworkers signed papers without meeting my eyes. The diners where couples laughed under neon while I sat with coffee grown cold. The hollow penthouses I once scrubbed where silence echoed against glass walls. Every place I had ever been reminded me of what it felt like to be an outsider. I braced myself to feel it again, but Garrick's words did not cut. They softened. "This woman," he said, his deep voice carrying over the fire, "stood before the beast and did not falter. She bled not for herself but for our child. She faced trials with no promise of belonging. She endured silence, suspicion, and pain. Yet still she remained, his eyes lifted to mine, steady, unflinching. There is no greater proof of loyalty than scars willingly earned." A murmur rippled through the tribe, soft, astonished, reverent. Garrick turned then, raising his arm. "From this night forward she is no longer stranger. She is sister. She is one of us." The word struck me harder than any wound ever had. Sister. The word I had never been called. The word denied to me in every place I had wandered. And then, like a tide breaking, the tribe rose to their feet and began to chant. The sound grew, swelling in waves that shook the night. Children pressed closer, elders lifted their hands, and warriors pounded their spears into the earth. Then something happened I could never have imagined. One by one they stepped forward. First an elder woman with gray hair braided in silver ribbons. She bowed her head, pressing her palm over her heart before lowering to one knee before me. Then another followed, and another, until the entire circle bent, shadows folding into reverence. They knelt not because I demanded it, but because they recognized it. Scars, pain, survival, all of it transformed into something larger than me. Oren stood at my side, his small hand gripping mine. His voice rang clear, louder than I'd ever heard it. "Bear sister." The chant spread like wildfire, voices rising and weaving together. Bear sister, bear sister. The name that began as a child's fragile whisper had become a chorus. Cassian Wolf stepped forward, his voice carrying above the chant. "An oath must be sealed," he said, and from his robes he pulled a strip of hide, worn but strong, dyed with patterns of red and black. He tied it around my wrist, the knots firm, unyielding. "This binds you," he said softly. "Not in chains, but in choice. Loyalty given to you is loyalty you must return. If they bleed, you bleed. If they rise, you rise. If they fall, you lift them." The hide pressed into my skin, warm against my pulse, as though it had always belonged there. For the first time in years, I felt the rawness of tears threaten my eyes, but I did not hide them. I let them fall. Because this was not weakness. This was recognition. This was forgiveness for every abandonment I had endured. This was the second chance I had never believed would come. The fire roared higher, sparks climbing like stars escaping gravity. Garrick Rowan bowed his head toward me, a gesture of honor so rare it left me trembling. "You came to us with nothing," he said. "You leave tonight with family." And in that moment, under the chanting of voices that no longer called me stranger, I realized the truth. I had not just saved Oren. In saving him, I had saved myself. They didn't just remember me as a woman, they remembered me as a legend. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm I had never known before. Mornings filled with the laughter of children, evenings woven with songs around the fire, nights spent beneath stars that seemed less lonely now. I had been given a place not because I was flawless, but because my flaws had meaning. The tribe did not erase my scars. They honored them the way they honored the cracks in old pottery as signs of endurance. Oren walked beside me everywhere, no longer the fragile boy trembling in the forest, but a child reborn into resilience. He carried himself differently now, still young, still tender, but braver. Sometimes he would slip his hand into mine without looking, a silent reminder of the bond forged in fire and blood. His presence healed me in ways I did not fully understand. I had spent years moving through life faceless, unseen, hidden behind distance. But with him, I felt recognized. There were moments when I caught my reflection in the water, and for the first time I didn't see just emptiness staring back. I saw resilience. I saw survival. I saw the faint beginning of belonging. It was not a fairy tale transformation. There were no crowns, no glass slippers, no perfect endings. It was messier, quieter, truer. Healing is not a storybook. Healing is a scar you learn to live inside. The tribe began to tell the story of the bear sister. Around fires, mothers whispered it to children. Elders wove it into songs. Hunters spoke of it as they set out, warriors as they sharpened blades. My story became theirs, and theirs became mine. And slowly I realized something I had never thought possible. I was no longer alone. But legends are not just about the past. They are also about what they mean for the future. I saw it in Oren's eyes when he looked at me. Not just gratitude, but hope. Hope that people could choose loyalty even when blood was not shared. Hope that scars could mean more than pain. Hope that second chances were real. There were nights when I sat awake long after the fire had dimmed, staring at the stars above the treetops. I thought of the cities I had left behind, the cracked sidewalks glowing under broken street lamps, the penthouse emptiness filled with glass and silence. The letters I had never written because I believed no one would read them. And now, here, beneath this sky, I realized that what I had searched for in cities of steel and glass I had found in a boy's fragile trust and a tribe's reluctant but real acceptance. I had thought survival was the only story I would ever live, but survival had only been the beginning. The real story was about healing, about redemption, about opening up after years of closing off, about finding in the most unplanned encounter the bond that remade me. Oren once asked me, his voice soft in the dark, "Why did you fight the bear?" I paused, searching for an answer that had eluded me even in my own thoughts. Finally, I said, "Because I knew what it felt like to be left alone, and I couldn't let that happen to you." He was quiet for a long time, his hand warm in mine. Then he whispered, "Then I will never leave you." The words anchored something deep inside me. They weren't fairy tale promises. They weren't the shallow vows of people who disappear when life becomes difficult. They were raw, unpolished, true, and that was enough. Years from now, maybe they will remember me not as Seraphine Hale, but as Bear Sister. Not because I was stronger than the beast, but because I chose to stand when running would have been easier. Not because I was flawless, but because I carried scars honestly. And maybe that's what legends really are. Not perfect stories, but truths born from pain, told and retold until they belong to everyone. As the fire burned low and Oren leaned against me, safe, steady, alive, I whispered to myself a truth I finally believed. I thought I saved one life, but they gave me a life worth living.